So who were these people that are forming these families? I want to make clear again that we're talking about free people in the American colonies. These are largely people who have come from a British background. They are almost universally white-skinned. They might be mixed race, but that's often hidden in the historical record. Simply by being free in America, they had a certain level of privilege in that they could control what occupations they did throughout the day. They often had a voice in who they married. They often were able to determine what kinds of tasks they were going to do. There were other people in the colonies who did not have those privileges. People who came as indentured servants had their lives controlled until they had worked out their contracts. People who came as enslaved people often had their lives controlled for their entire lives. Native Americans were excluded from European society. In some cases, they assimilated. They conformed to the demands of European society to blend in with the white community. So the people that we're talking about in these lectures are just the ordinary people of America, but they also have privileges that many other people in the colonies did not have at the time. I want to talk about two specific women in the colonial period only because you don't hear women's names as often, and I wanted to bring them up. Eliza Lucas Pinckney is pretty famous. You will maybe have passed her in some other class at some point. She was privileged by any definition you want to make. She was the child of a plantation owner in South Carolina. She was highly educated. She was probably a little bit spoiled, and she was also really smart. Her father gave her this good education and then basically booked it back to England. Said, yeah, you can take care of this, Eliza. Left her in charge of 3 plantations and went off back to England. She used her power over these plantations to develop indigo as a viable crop. Indigo is the plant that gives the color to your blue jeans, and it's really, really pretty. You actually don't see things that are genuinely dyed in indigo very often. It's a super dark blue. It's gorgeous. So she developed this just as industrialized textiles were starting to be produced and there was a demand for dye. She developed indigo as a viable crop and made her father a fortune, made herself a fortune. She also wrote letters and kept diaries that have put her voice into the historical record. Another person that you may have come across at some point, but is certainly less famous than Eliza Lucas Pinckney was, is a woman named Martha Ballard, who was a midwife in Maine in the mid to late colonial period and into the early Republic. The reason we know about Martha Ballard is that when she was about 50 years old, she began keeping a diary. And the diary was mostly just a record of births that she had attended, because sometimes midwives were called on to give testimony. If there was a question about whether or not a woman had killed her child, or a question about who the father of a particular child was, maybe a question about how old is this particular child, midwives would be called on to give sworn testimony about their experiences. So that's possibly why Martha began keeping this diary. But within her diary, she not only talked about the births that she attended, she talked about the gardening that she did. She talked about the textile work that she did. She talked about fighting with her daughters. She talked about events in her neighborhood. So it gives us a really low-level view of life in colonial Maine in around the 1770s and the 1780s. Martha Ballard was fairly educated. She had a lot of misspellings in her diary. You know, she's not educated in the way that Eliza Pinckney was, but she gives a sense of all the many, many tasks that women did and the responsibilities and the social power that even a very ordinary woman like Martha Ballard had. So it's easy for us looking at the colonial period to focus on what men did, primarily because the men left the most records. The men were the ones who were signing the wills and writing the newspapers and doing that kind of business. But the evidence left by people like Eliza Pinckney and Martha Ballard show that women were doing a lot of tasks as well. Women were doing a lot of work within the community. Just the fact that they didn't leave records tends to mean that they get written out of history. You all grew up in some kind of a family structure, and I know that your family group, however it was configured, had particular tasks that needed to be done throughout the day. Somebody needs to get some food on the table, somebody needs to fold some laundry, somebody needs to bring in some wages. The same thing, of course, was true in the colonial period. There were jobs that had to be done throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the year. And in the colonial period, those jobs were generally divided along male and female lines. Very generally, you can break this down to say that women took care of things that were indoors. They were in the house, and the barnyard actually counted as part of the house. The barnyard might be where the chickens and the geese were. The barnyard included the vegetable garden very often. That all was female area. The male tasks were everything outside the house. So when the men went into the barn, they went out to the fields, and when they went beyond their family property to go into town. Women, by and large, because it happened inside the house, had control of food preparation, textile production, the garden, and the poultry, as I already mentioned. Today, we talk about getting some food on the table, and that might be something as simple as chucking some Easy Mac in the microwave. In the 18th century, of course, that wasn't the case. There was no microwave, there was no Easy Mac. If you wanted to have chicken dinner, the first step was going out and killing the chicken. Women had control of every part of the stage of food production from the time the animal was dead. So the men might be in charge of slaughtering and rough butchering. Everything else the women did. They took the cow, they broke it down into steaks and sausage and everything that they needed. And of course, they weren't only making meals for that day. The family needed to produce enough food to last all year, and that included during the times when food wasn't growing at all. So around about September and October, they needed to start thinking about how are they going to store food that's going to last them through the winter. So that is a huge responsibility and was the main task that women would have been engaged in on a day-to-day basis. A longer term task that women engaged in whenever they weren't busy with food production was textile production. They're at the very, very beginning of industrial textile production at this point. So you really can't run down to the shop and buy some cloth to make yourself a dress. Almost everything that the family wore had to be made literally from scratch. The guy would grow a field full of flax. It's like grass, like flax is grass, and then you do all this stuff to it until you can spin it into yarn and then thread and then you weave it. It's really complicated. And so everything from the very beginning of that production was up to women. And the same thing with wool. You start out with a sheep and the guy does the shearing. Everything after that, the carding and the roving and the spinning and all of those tasks are done by women. And that's something that was ongoing throughout the year. Whenever they had a little bit of free time, oh, let's sit down and get some spinning done. Oh, I forgot to rove that wool. I better get the wool roved. So these two tasks, food production, textile production, take up by far the bulk of women's lives. Notice that there's nothing on there about cleaning and childcare. Everybody wants to say women in the colonial period were housewives. They cleaned and took care of the kids. No, they didn't have time to clean and take care of the kids. They also had no germ theory. There was no reason to clean because they didn't realize that being dirty could be dangerous to their health. The kids were basically on their own. Once they were weaned, they're more hands to gather the chicken eggs and weed the garden. They're not seen as being little precious things that have to be guided up, and our conception of childhood as a time of protected play totally didn't exist in the colonial period. The women are too busy trying to make sure the family has something to eat and something to wear. They're not worried about precious little Molly's education. What we think about as female tasks today, the cooking and the cleaning, the laundry, that sort of thing, is reproductive labor. And reproductive labor basically means work that you do to keep the family going, but doesn't add economic value to the household. Obviously, it has great value. You can't have a family without reproductive labor, but it's not adding wealth to the family. It's adding a quality of living. The food preparation, the textile production that women did was productive labor. They were adding value to the household. Reproductive labor was the child care, the cleaning. Those were things that they did them when it was necessary, but it was really low on their priority list. Now, the men had a whole bunch of other things to do as well. I don't want you to think that men were lazing around with their feet up smoking a pipe while women are doing all of this work. Men were in charge of the large animals, the cattle, the horses, the sheep, the hogs. All of those animals are male responsibilities. The large field crops, so the corn, the wheat, the potatoes, whatever was in a field as opposed to in the garden, were male tasks. Everything about the house, the barn, the fences, any kind of building and construction, men had to do. The economic transactions for the household, if they have to sell something, if they have to buy something, if they have to trade something, all of that is a male occupation. So even if the wife is saying, I need some more sugar, I need some more tea, it's the guy who's going to go to the shop and get that if there is a shop available. And because men's sphere of activity was outside the house, it was also the man's task to vote for the family. And this is something that we don't really tend to understand today. Voting was largely connected to property. If there was a piece of property, somebody voted representing that property in the government. The men cast that vote because it was the men who left the house who went to town. That was their general task. But their vote was not really representing their individual thoughts in theory. The vote was representing the best interests of their family and their property. It's only a little bit later on, it's only in the 19th century that people begin to think of the vote as something that is connected to an individual instead of connected to a family or connected to a piece of property. I imagined doing this lecture outside, and I thought, oh, the goldfinches will chirp. Maybe we'll hear a train. It'll be fine. And it's like I'm in Grand Central Station. Oh my God. So the European marriage tradition put men in charge. This is that patriarchal family. So men were supposed to be the leaders. Puritan theology said that they were God's deputy. So men are supposed to be in charge. But remember, these people are living in this deep rural isolation that often a man and his wife and maybe an in-law, maybe a grandparent would be the only adults in easy reach. They'd be the only grown-ups nearby to get stuff done. And what that meant is that adult women had social and economic power in America that they didn't tend to have in Europe. In Europe, a guy could always find his neighbor to help get the harvest in or to wrestle a cow to the ground. In America, they don't. They've got to get their wife to come and help. So women were able to take on a more powerful role within the typical American family than they were able to within typical European families. This leads to an idea that historians have called deputy husbands. And in this way, in the same way that men were considered to be God's deputy, they're speaking in place of God within their families. The deputy husband idea was that women could speak in place of their husbands. If their husband is sick, they can make decisions on his behalf. They can vote on his behalf. They can trade and do all these coded masculine things in the name of their husbands. So what this tells us is that women were recognized as being competent. Women were recognized as being adults, as having decision-making powers, of being important to the household. And that's an idea that tends to get lost later in history. As we get into the industrial period, women lose that sense of importance in the family. So I really want to emphasize here in the colonial period, the fact of the isolation and the hardships of family life meant that men and women were on a more equal footing than they might be later in American history.